This section is on common statistical tests in psychology and recognizing what situation it's appropriate to use which statistical test. And there's also a couple on this slide that I'd say are not so common really in psychology, even though they are common statistical tests. And I literally I'm going to call this a pre-quiz. And by calling it a pre-quiz, that means I really don't expect you to know the answers to these things. There's some evidence that if you quiz people on stuff that they don't know anything about, and then you teach it to them, that actually enhances their attention to it, and they remember it better later. So I really don't think most people in this class really are going to know these things. And that's why we're doing this pre-quiz, is to kind of focus your attention on these things. And when they teach it to you now through this pre-quiz, first of all, and if they come up again later, you'll pay attention to them. And if this is for statistics, then most of these will come up later. And if this is for experimental psychology, I actually do this in both classes, then only a few of these will actually come up during the class. So I have listed here, it's certainly not every statistical test, not by any means, but these are really some of the most common things that psychologists use, that they publish papers using these statistical tests. And these are also things that you could have encountered as an undergraduate. If you haven't taken statistics, of course, you wouldn't have. But these are some of the things that in graduate school, they want you to know, they want you to have the knowledge of when to use which statistical test, and that's really what this little pre-quiz is about. Literally, the questions that I've taken here, some of them are slightly modified, but I've taken these questions directly from Emory University. They have an online tool for incoming graduate students, basically to assess, do they know statistics? And that's what this is. So I figure, why not give this to you as undergraduates so you can get a sense of what they're looking for in graduate students. And this really is, I'd say, a really big thing, that if you're looking to try to get a PhD in psychology, they want you to know how research methods match up with statistics, know which situation it's appropriate to use which statistical test. So the first one, I'm going to run through these, and then we'll go through the pre-quiz. The first test you need to know about is called a one-sample t-test. And I would say it's pretty uncommon, like in a published psychology article. So in what situation would you use a one-sample t-test? There's also a one-sample z-test. They're very similar. It's also, I would say, uncommon in psychology. Well, both the one-sample t-test and the one-sample z-test, they're called one-sample because you're not comparing two different groups of people. It's not like you're doing an experiment and you're testing, it's not like you're randomly assigning it to two groups. You only have one group in a real sense that you're actually studying. But here you're comparing your one sample, your one group, to a population. Both tests are doing that. In one case, you have, I guess you might say, full population information. You have the mean and the standard deviation of the population. And in the other case, you're doing the same sort of thing, but you don't have that full population. You don't have the standard deviation. The next test is called the t-test for independent means. And I want to contrast it with the t-test for dependent means. A t-test for independent means is used when you have two independent groups. That's why it's called independent means. So if you did a simple two-group experiment where you gave one group alcohol and the other group a placebo, they thought they were eating alcohol, but they didn't. They got sugar. They got a non-alcoholic beer or something. And you wanted to see their differences in terms of a driving ability test and some kind of controlled driving ability, not out there in the wild. Or let's say you wanted to look for a sex difference. Males and females, they're two different independent groups. A sex difference in jealousy. Maybe men are more jealous than women. They aren't, but just hypothetically. anytime you have it's called independent means because it's for a between groups design. The t-test for dependent means, it's the same sort of situation, except it's when you're doing a within subjects design, or actually there's one exception to that. Really, it's whenever you have two sets of data, two conditions that you're comparing, and the two conditions are not totally independent of each other. In some way, they're linked. And I'm just going to give you this away. This is going to come up on the quiz. For example, if you had pairs of twins, pairs of identical twins, for example, the fact that they're twins makes their data non-independent, so it would be dependent. Another test is called a one-way ANOVA. This is kind of similar conceptually. It's kind of doing the same sort of thing that a t-test for independent means is doing. You can actually, instead of doing a one-way ANOVA, you can technically do a few or more t-tests for independent means. You wouldn't want to do that, though, and there's good statistical reasons for that. But a one-way ANOVA, you would use that in a situation where you have more than two conditions, more than two groups. So think of a t-test for independent means where you're comparing the means between three or more groups. And you would use a one-way ANOVA in that situation. The next statistical test is a Pearson's correlation, which goes by the symbol lowercase r in italics. A Pearson correlation, named after the guy, Pearson, who invented it. A Pearson correlation is the most common type of correlation used in psychology. It's where you have two continuous variables and you're looking for a correlation between them. The Spearman rank correlation, or rho, very similar to the Pearson correlation, except at least one of your variables is ordinal rather than continuous. So you have one variable that's a rank order variable. Next test, multiple regression. Multiple regression, actually it's a very, very flexible statistical test. And in a real sense, you might say that it's you can use it in a lot of different situations. Really, the only absolutely required thing to use it is that you have a continuous dependent variable or outcome variable. But most commonly, multiple regression is thought of as when you have multiple continuous predictors and just one continuous outcome variable. And you're using each of those multiple predictors to try to predict the outcome variable. So multiple regression, it's kind of like doing a bunch of correlations at once, a bunch of Pearson correlations at once. There's also logistic regression, which is really not going to come up in this class. Logistic regression could be used when you have a continuous predictor and a categorical outcome variable or dependent variable. There's factorial ANOVA. Remember back we mentioned one-way ANOVA previously. A one-way ANOVA is where it's called one-way because you have just one independent variable, one categorical variable they're using to predict a continuous dependent or outcome variable. That's the one-way ANOVA. A factorial ANOVA, it's kind of like a fancier ANOVA. It's called factorial, or sometimes it's called a two-way ANOVA, if you just have two independent variables. It's called a factorial ANOVA, or a two-way, because you can have two or more independent variables. With the one-way ANOVA, you can only have one, but that one independent variable can have three, or as many as you want, three or more levels to it. With a factorial ANOVA, though, you can have two or more, as many as you want, independent variables themselves. And each of those independent variables can have multiple levels to it. So we'll talk about a factorial design. Well, some kind of factorial ANOVA can be used to analyze that typically if certain assumptions are made. And there's a between design version of a factorial ANOVA and also a within design version. And there's also a mixed factorial ANOVA where you can mix a between and within design together. So if you have more than one independent variable, like you do in a factorial design, then one of those independent variables could be administered between subjects. So one group would get one level of the independent variable, and another group, a different set of people, would get the other level of the independent variable. But a second independent variable, at least one of them, in a mixed factorial design, is going to be administered what's called within subjects, or as a repeated measures variable. So with a mixed design, you have both. You have an aspect that is a between groups or between subjects design, and you have one aspect, another independent variable, that's administered as a within subjects or repeated measures kind of design. That the within subjects or repeated measures kind of design, that means that every subject is going to be exposed to both levels. So you have two levels of the independent variable. They're going to be exposed to both levels of it, not just one. So in a sense, they're going to be serving as their own control subject, their own control condition. Another common statistical test that you'll see in a lot of psychology papers is the chi-squared test, the chi-squared test of independence. Sometimes it's referred to as the Pearson chi-squared. Same guy that came up with the Pearson correlation. Well, a chi-squared test, with Pearson's correlation coefficient, it was two continuous variables, and you're correlating them. You're looking for a relationship between two continuous variables. With a chi-squared test of independence, you're looking for a relationship between two categorical variables, two nominal variables. So, for example, in my undergraduate thesis, we were looking at sex differences in questions where participants were forced to choose, after they read a couple scenarios, which of two things would be more upsetting to them. And it was scenarios related to infidelity. They had to either choose an example of sexual infidelity or emotional infidelity. So we had two categorical variables. We had the participant's biological sex, male or female, and we had whether they chose the emotional infidelity or the sexual infidelity is more upsetting. So when you're analyzing this categorical data like that, you can use a chi-squared test. It's good for when you have both a categorical predictor and a categorical outcome or dependent variable. And the last statistical test that we won't be doing in this class really, but it's important enough for you to at least be familiar with it, is called an ANCOVA. By the way, ANOVA stands for Analysis of Variance. Analysis of variance. And when you think about it, that's actually kind of a silly name for a statistical test because variance really lies at the heart of all of our statistical tests. So it's kind of silly to say that you're analyzing variance. That's pretty much all the tests. But that's what ANOVA stands for, Analysis of Variance. And COVA, it's the same thing, you just inserted a C in there in the middle, basically. It stands for Analysis of Covariance. What's a covariate? Well, a covariate is some other variable that correlates with your predictor variable. So an ANCOVA could be useful if you want to statistically control for this potential covariate and then do an ANOVA. So it's doing an ANOVA. It's like doing a one-way ANOVA where you're statistically controlling for a confound maybe or a covariate, some extraneous variable. It's one example of a situation you'd use an ANCOVA. So let's jump into the actual test. I know after hearing that, no one really remembers anything, and again, I don't really expect you to, not at this point. But as we go through this, just try to pay attention to what situation you would use different statistical tests. First one. Again, it's going to be multiple choice. Choose the correct statistical test to test your hypothesis. A psychologist wanted to test the hypothesis that people are more likely to use problem-focused coping when their level of stress is high. Working adults are asked to report the number of stressful life events and the number of different coping strategies they used to cope with these events. Choose the statistic you would use to test your hypothesis. It might also be useful for us to think about whether your test is directional or non-directional, but I'm not going to ask you to do that for all of these. For those of you unfamiliar with that, if it's directional, that means your hypothesis is in a particular direction. Meaning, for example, if you were doing a correlational study, a directional hypothesis would be that the correlation is positive, or a different directional hypothesis would be the correlation is negative. A non-directional hypothesis would be, well, I think there's going to be a correlation, but I'm not sure if it'll be positive or negative, so we're kind of looking for both. Usually, if you have a good theory, you do have a directional hypothesis that makes a specific prediction. But again, back to our example. Really the two key things to think about in determining which statistical test is appropriate is, number one, you have to identify the variables. What are the variables in this example? And you have to think, are these variables, which one is the predictor variable, which one is the outcome variable, and are these variables categorical, nominal, or are they continuous, or possibly ordinal? So here, again, working adults are asked to report on the number of stressful life events and the number of different coping strategies. So number of stressful life events, is that continuous or categorical? Nominal or continuous? A number, where the number represents an amount to something, a number of something, that's continuous. They're also reporting on the number of different coping strategies used. Is that categorical or continuous? Again, it's a number of something, so it's continuous. And the hypothesis is that people are more likely to use the problem-focused coping when they have high stress. So we have two continuous variables, and we want to find the relationship between them. So what's the appropriate statistical test? Here it's going to be C, Pearson's R. And I've already tried to describe the thought process behind why. It's because you have two continuous variables and you're looking for a relationship between them. We're predicting one continuous outcome by using one continuous predictor. The predictor is the problem-focused coping. Or rather, the predictor is level of stress, and the outcome is problem-focused coping. Second one, a researcher wished to increase the predictability of student pilot scores on the FAA's written exam. Dependable relationships were found to exist between number of hours of ground school and exam scores, and between review or practice time and exam scores. So really, they're looking for two different relationships here. They found two relationships here. One between number of hours of ground school and exam scores, and another between practice time and exam scores. So exam scores is common to both of those things, and it is the outcome variable here. So you're trying to predict exam scores really from two other things. Well, let's run through the choices. Pearson's R, will that work? Well, I guess technically it could work. We do have continuous variables here. Number of hours of ground school, that's continuous. Exam scores is continuous. Practice or review time is continuous. Exam scores, again, is continuous. So we have all continuous variables. Technically, you could run two different correlations here. But it's really not the most appropriate thing, because you could look at these two relationships simultaneously by doing a different test. Is it factorial ANOVA? When do you use a factorial ANOVA? We said it's when you have two or more independent variables and they would be categorical, and one continuous dependent variable. We don't have that here. Here we have all continuous variables. We don't. If it's a factorial ANOVA, it would be categorical predictor variables, an independent variable. So it's not A, not B, C. Multiple regression. Would that work? Well, I said that multiple regression was kind of like a fancy Pearson's R, where you can do more of correlation than one at a time. So that is the correct answer. And the reason is that we're predicting an outcome variable measured on a continuous scale, the exam scores, by two predictor variables, and we can do that at the same time, both relationships at the same time with multiple regression. Third one, again, try to be coming up with the answer before I tell you the answer. Maybe pause the video and think about it. A political analyst wants to know whether the political slant of a newspaper affects the voting preference of its readers. A random sample of homes was selected where the liberal newspaper was delivered. Also, a random sample of homes receiving the conservative newspaper was selected. The voting preference of each head of household was obtained and categorized as Republican, Democrat, or other. So think about what types of variables we have here. They want to know if the slant of the newspaper affects voting preference. They want to know if slant of the newspaper predicts the voting preference. How do they measure the slant of the newspaper? They just had two samples of homes that got the liberal newspaper, one that got the conservative newspaper. So is that a categorical or continuous variable? That's going to be categorical. Some homes got liberal, some homes got the conservative paper. There's no continuous in between or anything like that. It's categorical. They also measured the head of household, how the head of household voted, Republican, Democrat, or other. So the numbers they would use to represent that would represent categories, either Republican, Democrat, or other. So we have a categorical predictor and a categorical outcome or dependent variable. So what's the appropriate statistical test? Which statistical test did I say we would use for categorical variables? All categorical variables. The answer is A, chi-squared test of independence. We have two independent samples, the homes getting the liberal newspaper, the homes getting the conservative paper. The predictor is categorical and the outcome is categorical. Because both the predictor and the outcome is categorical, a chi-squared test of independence is appropriate. Next one. A college is concerned that recent cohorts of students have less motivation to succeed than earlier cohorts of students. To assess their concern, they gave a standardized, they know some stuff about it, standardized measure of achievement orientation to a random sample of college freshmen and sophomores. They compared their achievement orientation scores to published norms that were already known, published norms for U.S. college students. So they had a mean and a standard deviation that you can see right here, which were published norms for college students. And they just have one sample, one group of students they want to compare to these known norms for college students. Well, the fact that we only have one set of students here should give away that it's not choice C or D, because both C and D deal with when you have two different conditions. Here we only have one condition, one sample. So it's either going to be A or B, a one sample t-test or a one sample z-test. And in one case, you would use one if you have full population information. Do we have that here? Yes, we do, because we have the mean and the standard deviation for college students in general in the U.S. And because we have that full population information, the answer is the one sample z-test. So a z-score has to do with a variable being in standard deviation units. That's why it's related to, when you have full population information, the standard deviation here, that's why it's going to be the z-test. If there's just one sample in the study, full population information is available. That's why it's the z-test rather than the t-test. And the outcome variable is measured as a continuous variable, measured on an interval scale. This achievement orientation was measured on a continuous scale. Some students have more of it, some less. Next one, a researcher wanted to know whether perception of a person's height depends on his or her perceived status. So really, the perceived status is the predictor or independent variable, and the perception of the height is the outcome or dependent variable. A random sample of Army inductees was selected and equally divided between 4 groups. So they're going to assign participants to 4 groups. An actor gave a short speech separately to each of the 4 groups, extolling the virtues of Army life. The groups differed as follows. Group 1, the actor was dressed as a private. Group 2, the actor was dressed as a sergeant. Group 3, the actor was dressed as a captain. And group 4, the actor was dressed as a colonel. So same guy dressed differently. And the 4 groups, they're dressed as someone of a different rank. So in rank order, 4 is higher than 1 in terms of rank. The inductees were asked to complete a questionnaire evaluating the speech. As part of the questionnaire, they were asked to estimate the lecturer's height. So they're manipulating the perceived status of the person by manipulating how they're dressed and their rank, and Army folks would be very familiar with that. So they're manipulating their rank or status to see if that affects how tall the person is perceived to be. So we have a predictor variable, and it's going to be, really it's going to be ordinal here, or categorical. We have 4 categories. They're either dressed as private, sergeant, captain, or colonel. And then the estimate of the height, that's going to be a continuous variable. So, could it be a one-way ANOVA? Well, we do have more than 2 groups here. So that seems to make sense. With a t-test, for example, will only work if we just have 2 groups. A t-test for independent means would only work if we have 2 conditions, 2 levels of our independent variable. So D is wrong because we have 4 different levels. So it's not D. How about multiple regression? Would that make any sense? Would C make any sense? Typically, not always, but typically when you use multiple regression, you'd have multiple continuous predictors and 1 continuous outcome variable. We have a continuous outcome variable, its height, but we don't have multiple predictors. We actually just have 1. The 1 is perceived status. Even though we have 4 levels to it, we only have 1 variable. All 4 of those different levels are just 1 variable. So multiple regression doesn't make any sense. Does factorial ANOVA make any sense? You'd use factorial ANOVA when you have more than 1 independent variable, more than 1 categorical independent variable. Actually, we don't have that here either for the same reason I just said. All of those 4 levels are really just one thing, 1 variable that's varying. It's status level. So we don't have more than 1 independent variable. So it is a one-way ANOVA. So here there are 4 independent groups. We have 4 independent groups, but it's just 1 independent variable. That's why it's a one-way ANOVA. And the DV, perceived height, is measured on a continuous scale, which is exactly what you want for any kind of an ANOVA. Next one, a researcher wished to test the hypothesis that taller men are more likely than shorter men to be judged as leaders. Do people think tall guys are judged as leaders, basically? A random sample of 30-year-old men was selected and measured for height. The men were then brought before a panel of personnel judges and ranked on the basis of perceived leadership qualities. Each subject was assigned the median rank. This is an important point. They were assigned the median rank of the panel's decisions. So by saying they were assigned the median rank, even though it's a median, is that going to be nominal, ordinal, or some kind of continuous scale variable? Because it's a rank, even though it's a median, that means it's ordinal. So it's measured, that variable is measured on an ordinal scale. It's a rank order scale. And they're trying to see if that rank relates to height. So they measured their height and measured the perceived rank. So they're trying to predict the perceived rank, an ordinal variable, from a continuous variable height. So it's a correlational kind of study. Well, let's run through our options. Option A, chi-squared test of independence. Well, what situation did I say we would use that? You use a chi-squared test of independence when you have a categorical predictor variable and a categorical outcome variable. Do we have that here? No, we don't. Height is a continuous variable, so chi-squared test is not going to work. Rank also, it's not nominal at least. B, a one-way ANOVA. Is that right? No, it's not. For a one-way ANOVA, you would want a categorical, nominal predictor variable and a continuous outcome variable. We don't have either one of those things. So it's some kind of correlational study, so it's going to be either C or D. We've already come across the Pearson correlation coefficient, which is the most common. That's when you have two continuous variables and you're seeing the relationship. With Spearman's correlation coefficient, that's when you are looking for a relationship between a continuous variable and an ordinal variable. So that is the correct answer, C. So there's one group in the study, there's a predictor and an outcome variable. The outcome variable is measured on an ordinal scale. That's when you would use Spearman's correlation rather than Pearson's, when there's an ordinal variable. Next one, a rat study was conducted to find out whether environmental inputs could affect brain growth. A group of 16 rat twins, so rats that are twins, they were bred to be twins, was selected at birth, and the rats were randomly assigned to one of two groups. The rats were thus paired off on the basis of genetic inputs, with one rat from each twin pair assigned to the experimental group and the other twin in the pair into the control group. So none of the rat twin pairs would be in the same group. They're going to be separated out into two groups. The experimental group was raised in a stimulating environment with toys, let's say exercise, a spinning wheel they can run in, stuff like that. These animals were also let out of their cages 30 minutes a day and allowed to explore. So they had an enriched environment. The other rats lived in a, let's say, impoverished environment. The other rats lived alone in dimly lit cages, were rarely handled, and were not allowed out of their cages. No exercise. All animals received the same diet. After 90 days, the animals were euthanized, sacrificed, and the weight of the brain cortex, was obtained and recorded in milligrams. Cortical weight of the two groups was compared. So what do we have here? How many predictor variables do we have? We just have the one predictor variable, and it has two levels to it. We have the group that was assigned to the enriched environment, and the other group, the other half of the twins, that was assigned to the impoverished environment situation. So that's your independent variable. What's the outcome or dependent variable? Here the dependent variable is cortical weight. So that's a continuous one. So we have a nominal predictor, or really it is an independent variable here. And we have a continuous dependent variable, or outcome variable. Brain weight, cortical weight. Is it Pearson's R? Does that make sense here? It's definitely not the best choice here. Pearson's R is most typically thought of as when you have two continuous variables you want to relate. Here we have a categorical predictor or independent variable, so that's not it. Is it B, a one-way ANOVA? You might think so, but here we only have two conditions. We just have the enriched and the impoverished environments, and we've seen that one-way ANOVA, that's typically only going to be used when you have more than two conditions. So it's going to be C or D, some sort of t-test. Either a t-test for independent means or a t-test for dependent means. And I told you earlier that, roughly speaking, a t-test for independent means is when it's a between subjects design. And roughly, a t-test for dependent means is when it's a within subjects or repeated measures design. This is a between subjects design, but I said earlier that because you have twins and you're creating the groups based on the pairs of twins, the two means that you get are not totally independent. Therefore, it's going to be the t-test for dependent means, D. So there's two groups in the study, but the two groups are dependent or they are correlated because of the fact they're dealing with twin pairs. So the dependent t-test rather than the independent t is appropriate here. And then the dependent variables measure on a continuous scale of measurement, which is not really unique to this. Next one, a researcher suspects, we're getting close to the end here now. A researcher suspects that both meaningfulness and length of presentation affect word retention, as scored on a standardized test. 4 groups of 5th grade students were randomly selected and then assigned to different treatment conditions. Group A was given low meaningful words and a 2-second presentation time. Group B was given a list of high meaningful words and also a 2-second presentation time. Group C, a third group, was given low meaningful words and a 5-second presentation time. And Group D received high meaningful words and a 5-second presentation time. The total number of words correctly remembered was recorded, and that was going to be the dependent variable. So what do we have here? Well, the dependent variable or outcome variable is total number of words remembered. Is that categorical or continuous? Total number, that's continuous. We have 4 groups, but be careful here. How many independent variables do we have? We do have, they are manipulating variables, so it's safe to call them independent variable and dependent variable. We have 4 conditions, but not 4 independent variables. We have 4 conditions. There are 2 different independent variables that were manipulated. There was, whether it was high meaningful or low meaningful, that's one independent variable. And there was, how long was the presentation time? Was it 2 seconds or 5 seconds? And those things are combined together in those 4 conditions. They're crossed. So there's 2 independent variables, each with 2 levels, and a continuous dependent variable. So let's run through our choices. Is it a chi-squared test of independence? When do you use that? You use that when you have a categorical independent variable and a categorical dependent variable. We don't have that here. Total number of words is continuous. Is it a one-way ANOVA? Well, we said that we said that you use a one-way ANOVA when? It's called one way because you use it when you only have one independent variable with more than 2 conditions. So here we said we have how many? We have 2 independent variables, so it's not B. C, factorial ANOVA, or sometimes some of the simplest kind are called two-way ANOVAs, factorial ANOVA. Here we have 2 independent variables, categorical, and a continuous outcome variable. this is appropriate to use a between sort of factorial ANOVA. So it's between because individuals were randomly assigned to just one of those four groups, A, B, C, or D. So it's a between sort of factorial ANOVA. Because it's purely between, there's no within aspect to this, it's not D, it's not a mixed factorial ANOVA. So it's what would be called a 2x2 factorial design. The 2x2, 2 times 2, 2 refers to really how many conditions there are. We said there were 4 conditions, 2 times 2 is 4. There were 2 independent variables, each one has 2 levels to it. So each one of the numbers, if you were to, any kind of factorial design can be described in this kind of multiplication kind of description. So a 2x2, each number here represents one independent variable, and the number itself represents how many levels that independent variable has. So meaningfulness had 2 levels. That's what that 2 represents. It had low meaningful and high meaningful words. The second 2 refers to the length of presentation time. We had short presentation time of 2 seconds and a longer presentation time of 5 seconds. That's why it's a 2x2. Here there are 2 independent variables, and the dependent variable is measured on a continuous ratio, really, scale of measurement. There's no repeated measures or within subjects aspect to it. That's why it's really a between factorial ANOVA and not a mixed, and not a within factorial ANOVA. All right, I think this is going to be the last one. A researcher wants to test if taking Viagra increases men's libido. Somehow behaviorally defined, men's libido, sex drive. There were 3 groups of men, a placebo group, a low-dose Viagra group, and a high-dose Viagra group. And men are going to be randomly assigned to those 3 conditions: placebo, low-dose Viagra, high-dose Viagra. The researcher realized that the libido of the participants' sexual partners may also affect the participants' own libido. And that makes it harder to do this study because it makes it harder to detect the effect of Viagra on the participants' own libido. So the researcher measured the partner's libido as well. How often they tried to initiate sexual contact. That's what that was defined as. And she measured that in order to, quote unquote, statistically control for its relationship with the participant's libido. So they wanted to get rid of it to see if Viagra was actually helping men's libido. So what's the answer here? Is it A, an ANOVA, an analysis of variance? Well, the situation does kind of seem like an ANOVA kind of situation. We have 3 groups, 3 conditions. We have just one independent variable with 3 conditions to it. That does seem like an ANOVA situation, trying to see if it affects the men's libido. But we also want to statistically control for something else, a covariate. So really the answer here is going to be C, ANCOVA, an analysis of covariance. And ANCOVA is like it's like doing a one-way ANOVA while statistically controlling for another variable. It's not a t-test. Why? Well, the short answer, the easiest thing to think is that we have 3 different levels, not just 2. We have placebo, low dose, and high dose. So a simple t-test wouldn't cut it. You'd have to do a bunch of t-tests, and that would actually be a bad thing statistically in terms of potentially capitalizing on chance. It wouldn't be a chi-squared test of independence because libido here is going to be measured continuously, not categorically. And then E, it wouldn't be a Spearman correlation because we're not looking for a relationship between an ordinal variable and another variable. So C is the answer. It's a situation where a one-way ANOVA seems to work. We have one independent variable with 3 levels to it, or 3 groups. Except we want to control for a covariate and then see if there's a relationship after controlling for that covariate. That's why it's analysis of covariance, ANCOVA. And that's it for this pre-quiz. Again, some of you might be scared at what you don't know after seeing that pre-quiz. It's not meant to scare you. It really is meant, number one, to help teach you that material, and number two, as we come across at least some of those statistical tests throughout the class, to keep in mind, try to understand what situation it's appropriate to use that particular statistical test.